Get on your knees and put it in your mouth, Mountain Man barked at the fat girl. She never expected this. Get on your knees and put it in your mouth. The command cut through the still air of the workshop. Delia Hayes froze, eyes wide. Heat rushed to her face as her mind scrambled to understand what the rugged mountain man could possibly mean. Across the room, Silas Wolfe Morrison frowned, holding a half-finished silver bracelet and a pair of tongs that glowed faintly from the forge. "What are you waiting for?" he barked again. "If you keep standing there, the mold will cool." Only then did Delia see the iron clamp lying on the floor by her feet, its hinge open like a hungry mouth waiting to hold the piece he'd been shaping. Embarrassment flooded her. Of course, he hadn't been shouting at her. He'd been shouting at the metal. She dropped to her knees quickly, sliding the glowing piece into the holder while sparks hissed on the stone. Wolf's voice softened just slightly. "Good. Now keep it steady." He moved beside her, his large hands guiding hers with practiced precision. The forge's firelight painted gold across his scarred cheek and the streaks of silver in his dark hair. Delia could feel the heat of the flame and the warmth of his nearness, and for a breath she forgot the fear that had driven her up this lonely mountain. "Careful," he murmured, adjusting her grip. "Jewelry remembers the hands that make it." When the metal cooled, he stepped back, studying her work. Not bad for someone who almost dropped a month's wages. Delia exhaled, half laughing, half mortified. She had no idea her first day assisting the infamous recluse of Blackstone Ridge would begin like this, a misunderstanding that would change both of their lives forever. Delia Hayes had never been this far from town before. The climb to Blackstone Ridge had taken her 3 hours through fog, pine, and the kind of silence that made a person hear their own heartbeat. When she finally reached Silas Morrison's cabin, a structure of rough-hewn logs tucked between cliffs and forest, she thought she'd come face to face with a legend. People in town called him the Wolf of the Ridge. Some said he'd once been a soldier, others whispered that he'd killed a man in a duel over gold. The truth, no one knew. What they did know was that his jewelry rings, pendants, and crowns of pure silver was sought by wealthy families as far away as Denver. Yet he lived alone, seeing only the occasional trader or messenger brave enough to make the climb. Delia needed the job more than she'd ever needed anything. Her father's heart had failed twice that winter, and the doctor's bills were swallowing the small home they shared. She'd taken work in a tailor's shop, in a bakery, even cleaning the sheriff's office, but nothing paid enough. When she heard the Wolf was looking for an assistant, someone steady-handed and discreet, she'd gone straight to the posting office and begged for the position. Now, standing in the dim workshop, the heat of the forge warming her face, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. Silas Morrison was not the kind of man she'd imagined. He wasn't cruel, but he was as sharp and distant as the mountain air. His voice carried authority that left no room for hesitation. Yet beneath that rough exterior, something about him radiated control like a wild animal that had learned to live in a cage of its own making. When she placed the cooled bracelet on his workbench, he inspected it under a magnifier. "The edges aren't even," he said without looking up. I'm sorry, sir. I'll do better." He adjusted his lenses, eyes narrowing. "I don't hire people to be sorry. I hire them to learn." Delia's pride bristled, but she bit her tongue. "Then I'll learn." That made him glance up, and for a heartbeat, His expression softened. "We'll see." The hours that followed tested every bit of patience she had. Silas worked in silence, moving between his bench, the anvil, and the forge with mechanical precision. When he did speak, it was only to correct her hand placement or warn her about a tool's temperature. By sunset, her arms ached, and her face was streaked with soot. When she turned to leave, he spoke again. "You'll stay here," he said. She blinked. "Here? Tonight?" "It's a 2-hour walk down to the valley. You'd freeze before you made it halfway. There's a spare room upstairs." Delia hesitated. "I didn't bring much." He shrugged. "Then you'll need less." And just like that, her world changed again. That night, she lay in the small loft above the workshop, listening to the sound of hammering below. He was still working long after dark, long after reason. The rhythmic clang of metal was strangely comforting. She turned toward the window, watching the stars blink over the peaks. For the first time in months, her fear wasn't about debt or sickness. It was about the man downstairs, his quiet intensity, his solitude, and the feeling that beneath all that steel and smoke, there was a story she wasn't meant to know. And Delia, curious and stubborn as she was, knew she would find out. The following morning, Blackstone Ridge glowed under a thin veil of mist. The valley below still slept, but inside the cabin, the forge was already awake, breathing, flickering, alive. Delia descended the narrow stairs to find Silas Morrison standing by the workbench, sleeves rolled up, a leather apron strapped across his chest. His movements were deliberate, almost graceful, as he filed the edge of a silver pendant. Sunlight spilled through the window and caught the dust in the air, turning it to gold. He didn't look up when he spoke. "You rise early." "I heard the hammering," she said, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "That's the mountain's heartbeat," he replied simply, setting down his tool. "You'll learn to keep pace with it." He handed her a small pouch of stones, tiny fragments of sapphire, emerald, and opal. "Separate them by hardness," he instructed. "The wrong order ruins everything." She took the pouch gingerly, spilling the gems across the table. They glittered like fragments of sky and ocean. "How do I tell?" she asked. "By touch," he said. "Each stone carries its own weight, its own resistance. You'll feel it if you're patient." Patience, she discovered, was the hardest lesson. Her hands shook at first, her eyes ached from squinting, but slowly she began to recognize the differences. He spoke of the cold gleam of sapphire, the softness of opal, the heavy pulse of garnet. Hours passed. The fire cracked, tools clinked, and outside the wind whispered through the trees. Silas worked in near silence, but now and then he'd murmur small instructions, his tone less severe than before. "Breathe slower. The stones respond to calm hands." Or, "Don't fight the metal. Guide it." He didn't praise often, but when he did, it was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "That's good, Delia," he said one afternoon as she polished a clasp. "Steady, deliberate. You've got an instinct for this." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I inherited it from someone who couldn't afford jewelry." He raised a brow. "Or maybe you were meant to make it instead of wear it." Their rhythm settled into something unspoken but natural. Every day they worked side by side, hammer and file, flame and patience. Silas taught her how to listen to the metal, how to feel when it was ready to bend. And in return, Delia taught him something he hadn't realized he'd lost: quiet laughter. She'd tease him about his perfectionism or hum while she worked, turning the silence of his cabin into something softer. He never told her to stop. Sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, she'd catch him watching her, his gray eyes softened, his expression unreadable. She pretended not to notice. One evening, while melting silver, Delia asked, "Why do you really live up here? You could sell your work anywhere." He hesitated before answering, "Because beauty attracts greed, and greed attracts violence." She frowned. "Someone hurt you?" He looked down at the molten metal. "I hurt myself first. The rest followed." She wanted to ask more, but something in his voice told her to let the subject rest. Instead, she whispered, "Then maybe you needed the quiet to start over." He turned to her, surprised by her gentleness. "Maybe I did." That night, the power flicker of the forge cast shadows that danced across the walls. Delia lingered after work, cleaning tools while he locked away finished pieces in a chest. "You don't have to stay late," he said. "I know," she replied, "but I like being here." For a moment, the air between them shifted, no longer master and apprentice, but something more fragile, unspoken. The flame reflected in his eyes, and for the first time, Silas smiled. "You're different from anyone I've ever met, Delia Hayes." "Is that a compliment?" she teased. "It's the truth." Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, carrying the scent of spring. Inside, the last ember of the forge glowed faintly between them, warm, alive, waiting. Neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. The mountain had found its rhythm again, and so had they. By April, the mountain had softened. The snow had melted into streams that sang down the slopes, and wildflowers began to bloom around the edges of the workshop. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney each morning, marking the rhythm of their days steady, calm, unhurried. Delia had learned to love that rhythm. She'd rise before sunrise to grind metal filings, polish stones, or brew coffee strong enough to keep the forge burning through noon. Sometimes Silas would already be working when she came down the stairs, hair tousled, apron dusted with silver powder, eyes focused on some tiny masterpiece. "Did you even sleep?" she'd tease. "I slept enough," he'd reply without looking up. "You mean you blinked twice?" A ghost of a smile would flicker across his face. That was his way of saying, "You're right." The cabin, once cold and silent, had changed. Cora filled it with small domestic details that made it feel alive. Fresh linens, wildflowers in tin cups, a bit of lace she'd sewn for the window. Silas never mentioned them, but he noticed. He always noticed. When she cooked, he'd pretend to keep working, though his hands would slow just enough to savor the smell of stew. When she hummed softly under her breath, he never interrupted, even though the melody drifted into his focus like sunlight breaking through clouds. One afternoon, while sorting gemstones, Delia nicked her finger on a sharp shard. "Ouch!" Silas turned instantly, crossing the room in 2 strides. "Let me see." "It's nothing," she insisted, but he had already taken her hand. He examined the small cut under the light, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "You need to wrap it. These stones carry residue from polish could infect fast." When he tied a strip of cloth around her finger, his hands lingered just a second too long. She caught his scent, smoke, pine, and something warm underneath. "Better," he murmured, eyes still on her hand. She smiled softly. "Thank you, Wolf." At the sound of the nickname, he looked up, startled. "Everyone in town calls you that," she explained. "The Lone Wolf of Blackstone Ridge." He smirked. "And what do you call me?" "Silas," she said quietly. "Just Silas." As the weeks passed, their partnership became more than work. He began trusting her with design sketches he'd never shown anyone. Sometimes they argued about them, but always with laughter between words. "This curve doesn't fit," she'd say, tracing a line on parchment. "It's perfect," he'd counter. "It's heavy," she'd insist. "So am I," he'd joke, earning the sound of her laughter, the one that filled every corner of the cabin. Together, they crafted things that took both their hands to finish. Delicate chains, filigree pendants, a silver locket shaped like a snowdrop flower. Each piece carried something of their shared rhythm, his precision, her instinct. By June, their workbench was full of beauty neither could have made alone. But it wasn't only art they were shaping. Some evenings, when the forge was dark and the mountain wind cool, they'd sit on the porch, sharing coffee in silence. She'd tell him stories about her father, how he used to carve little birds for her as a child, how his laughter filled their small house in town. "He sounds like a good man," Silas would say. "He is," she replied softly. "He just doesn't know how to let go of guilt, thinking my mother's illness was his fault." He nodded slowly. "I understand that." She looked at him then. "You still blame yourself too, don't you?" He didn't answer, but she saw the truth in his eyes, the weight of it, years deep. One evening, as twilight washed the ridge in pink and gold, Silas set something on the table before her, a small silver charm in the shape of a wolf's paw, etched with careful detail. "It's for you," he said. She turned it over in her palm. "It's beautiful. But why? Because you're braver than you think. You came up this mountain, faced every mistake I made, and never once looked afraid." Her throat tightened. "I was afraid. Still am sometimes." He smiled faintly. "Then you hide it well." Delia slipped the charm onto a thin chain and fastened it around her neck. "Then I'll wear it until I stop being afraid." Later that night, the forge burned low, casting amber light over their faces as they worked side by side on a single project, a sapphire pendant for a client in Denver. Their hands brushed more than once, and neither pretended not to notice. When the final stone was set, she looked up at him and whispered, "I think this is the most beautiful thing we've ever made." He studied her face for a long moment. "I disagree." "What do you mean?" He reached out, brushing a smudge of soot from her cheek. "It's not the pendant that's beautiful, Delia. It's the person who brought light into this place." For once, she couldn't find a clever reply. The forge hissed, the night deepened, and the mountain outside stood silent as if it, too, was listening. Summer settled on Blackstone Ridge with long golden days and thunderstorms that rolled like drums through the valley. The little workshop thrived. Traders now hiked the trail to commission Morrison pieces, curious about the woman who worked beside the wolf. But peace has a way of drawing envy. One afternoon, while Silas was away collecting ore from the stream, a man on horseback rode up the path. Delia heard the hoofbeats and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. The stranger wore a fine coat and a cruel smile. "Miss Hayes, isn't it? Your father sent me." Her stomach dropped. "My father?" "He says you've been keeping company with a thief." the man said, dismounting. Claims Silas Morrison stole a diamond from a client 2 years ago. He's asked me to bring you home before the law gets here. Delia's pulse pounded. My father owes money. Who sent you? Men who collect debts. The man's eyes swept the cabin greedily. Pretty setup you have here. Shame if it burned. Before she could answer, another voice came from behind. Touch that door, and you won't leave the ridge alive. Silas stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle in hand, rain glinting on the barrel. His tone was calm, but his eyes were cold as the steel he forged. The stranger sneered, "So the wolf still bites." "I don't want trouble," Silas said. "Ride down while you still can." The man hesitated, then swung into the saddle and spat at the ground. "You'll hang for what you stole, Morrison. They're coming." He rode off into the storm. Inside, Delia slammed the bolt across the door. Her hands trembled. What did he mean? What diamond? Silas stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "I was commissioned to make a crown for a mining company's owner. When the shipment left Denver, the main stone was gone. They said I stole it. I didn't. But it didn't matter. They put a price on my head, so I disappeared." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "Because I thought the past had finally stayed buried." Delia stepped closer. "You think running makes you guilty?" He met her gaze. "It makes me tired." "Then stop running," she said. "We'll face it." He shook his head. "You don't understand how these men work. They'll twist the truth, drag you down with me." "I don't care," she whispered. "I know who you are." Something in his expression cracked relief and fear, colliding. For days they prepared in silence. He hid the tools, packed what they could carry, reinforced the shutters. Delia helped without complaint, though her heart broke each time she saw him dismantle the life they'd built. One night, lightning flashed across the ridge. She found him sitting by the forge, head bowed. "You were right," he said quietly. "I can't keep running, but I won't let them take this place or you." She knelt beside him. "What will you do?" He looked up, eyes fierce. "I'll finish the piece they accused me of stealing. I kept the sketches. If I deliver it myself, maybe the truth will finally have weight." Delia touched his arm. "I'll go with you." "No," he began, but she shook her head. "You taught me precision and courage. You don't get to send me away now." He studied her a long time, then nodded. "All right. But when we walk down that mountain, we do it together." Outside, thunder rolled over the peaks. Inside, the forge flared once more, throwing sparks against the dark. The wolf of Blackstone Ridge was no longer hiding, and beside him stood the woman who refused to let him fall. 3 days later, the trail down from Blackstone Ridge glistened with rain. Silas and Delia reached the mining town at dusk, carrying nothing but a leather case that held the finished crown. The streets smelled of coal smoke and distrust. They walked straight into the company hall, where the owner, Mr. Lang, stood behind a polished desk surrounded by guards. The missing diamond's empty setting was displayed on a velvet cloth like a wound. Silas placed the new crown on the desk. "You accused the wrong man," he said evenly. "The design you wanted complete, as promised." Lang's eyes narrowed. "You think a trinket clears your name?" Silas flipped open the case to reveal the blueprint he'd kept hidden for years. "This is the pattern I filed before the theft. Every measurement, every mark of the original gem's cut. Compare them. You'll see the diamond never fit the mount that left Denver. Someone switched stones before it reached me." Lang's face blanched. One of the guards leaned closer to the blueprint. "He's right, sir. The prongs don't match." Delia stepped forward, voice steady. "You needed a scapegoat. He lost his life for your mistake." Lang turned red with fury. "You have no proof who took it." "You do now," came a voice from the doorway. The messenger who'd ridden up the mountain days before stepped inside, hat in hand. "Tell him, boss. I sold that gem for you in Cheyenne. I kept the papers." The room fell silent. Lang's bravado crumbled. Silas didn't move. He simply said, "Truth has weight, same as gold. It always sinks to the bottom sooner or later." Lang lunged for a pistol, but before he could draw, one of his own guards pinned his arm. "We're done working for thieves," the man growled. When it was over, the sheriff took Lang away in irons. Reporters scribbled notes. Townsfolk whispered the wolf's name with something new in their tone respect. Outside, rain began again, soft this time. Silas stood on the porch, watching it wash the dust from his boots. Delia joined him, slipping her hand into his. "It's finished," she said. He nodded. "No, it's beginning." They walked away from the hall together, the crown still gleaming in its case, a proof of innocence, yes, but also of faith. Behind them, the thunder of justice rolled across the valley. Ahead, the mountain waited, patient and quiet, ready to welcome them home. By the time they reached Blackstone Ridge again, dawn was just spilling over the peaks. The rain had washed the trails clean, leaving the mountains smelling of pine and new beginnings. Silas stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked toward the cabin. Smoke already curled from the chimney. Delia had coaxed the fire back to life. The forge, dark for days, would soon sing again. He set down the leather case and turned to her. "You could go back now," he said quietly. "Your name's clear. You've proved more than I ever did." Delia shook her head, the morning light catching the silver charm at her throat. "Town never felt like home. This place does. You do." He smiled, not the guarded half-smile of before, but something full, real. "Then we stay." They walked into the cabin together. The crown lay on the table beside the sketches and tools that had once defined his solitude. Now they looked like symbols of something larger, redemption shaped in silver and flame. Silas poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "Strange," he murmured, "how a man can spend years carving metal and still not know how to shape his own life." Delia touched his hand. "You were just waiting for the right design." Outside, sunlight climbed the ridge, painting gold across the valley. Inside, laughter mingled with the sound of hammer and flame. The mountain that had once hidden a fugitive now sheltered 2 artisans who had forged not only beauty, but belonging. And when the wind passed through the pines, it carried the faint, rhythmic sound of the forge, the heartbeat of 2 lives beginning again. Every story leaves a trace like the mark of a craftsman's tool on silver. Delia and Silas remind us that sometimes the greatest art isn't forged from gold or gems, but from trust, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. If you're listening to this, tell me where in the world are you hearing their story? Because love, like craftsmanship, survives through the hands that keep believing. If you still believe in quiet strength and second chances, stay close. The next story waiting on this mountain might just be yours.